Thank you for the invitation, Ambassador, and thank you all for showing up and listening to this exciting theme about Mongolia. I have been in charge of the EBRD's, if you can say, mining operations for the past 3.5 years, and this has been when I came when prices were high, and hopefully they will get back up there one day. So this has been an exciting change of cycle for us, and most of our investments have actually gone into Mongolia in the mining sector. So pleased to have the opportunity to share with you a bit of our experience. But the theme I've been asked to talk about is more on the risk side, and namely the sort of geopolitical issues, I would say investor concerns, if you wish, and that's a challenge. And I've had sleepless nights over how to talk about that. First, without overlapping what somebody else has been saying, but also try to say something that can make you reflect a little bit. So in the end, I decided to try to take the shoes on as if I was an investor and look a little bit on Mongolia and talk about that unique situation, the sandwich, which Mongolia is in between Russia and China, which is an opportunity, but also has other implications. How do I use this? Okay, thank you. Now, I can see I have already overrun my time before I started, so do I have 5 minutes left? 5 minutes. Then you have to maybe read the presentation yourself. Let me go straight to the point. Is there anyone here who do not know who EBRD is? No hands up, so everyone knows who EBRD is. And you're right, it is an international financial institution owned by 65 governments. The latest shareholder we got was China. Very convenient for us. They got 0.01% of our shares, and we were the largest IFI, international financial institution, where China is not a member. So what did they want with EBRD? Because most of our business is not out in China. I think they wanted to see how we do business, learn from it, and take it back home, and hopefully also Mongolia will benefit from that, because China is a big investor, or certainly a big consumer of what comes out of Mongolia. So in essence, we do about 9 billion euros of investments a year from our own pocket. And when we invest €1, we typically find 2 euros from other investors. So that's how we operate. In the region where we are present, which is the former Soviet Union, some Middle East, North Africa and Turkey, Central Asia, also Mongolia. In that whole region, we have invested over 4,000 projects since we were put into operation 20 years ago, and put into that region more than 100 billion euros. So in my team, we have done about 8 billion of investment so far in roughly 200 projects. We have an in-housing engineer, a miner, an engineer who knows everything about a mine, so we don't have to spend so much time with external consultants, but we do nonetheless. And we have our bankers. They're sitting out in the region. I have 2 of them sitting in Mongolia at all times. Let me just jump over the challenges, because that was just beautifully explained by my previous speaker. And just briefly show these flowers here. These are in a number of sectors: gold, copper, iron ore, coal, nickel, lead, zinc, all minerals that are interesting in Mongolia. And when you ask an investor, sort of, you can say a bit superficially, what are the risks? Well, the answers are different depending on which metal you as a miner, as an investor, are working in. But many of them you can see a bit similar. The red one here is the social license to operate. That basically means that the way you operate with the community, with your host government, is one that needs to be taken seriously, handled carefully, in order to have the license, or so say the support, to continue your operations. So let me focus a little bit on that in the interest of time. And let me find out how this... Oh, there you are. No, that was a mistake. Okay. It's a bit like driving a car. I'm not good at that either. Okay. Could you make this, get it to show all the screen? Is that possible?
I think we could.
Okay. I want to give you a Japanese advice there. This one. Okay. Maybe we can see.
This gentleman here is the...
Maybe you can help us show the whole screen. So I once met a Japanese who gave me such a beautiful piece of advice, and it's written there in Japanese. Anyone who do not read Japanese? Again, no hands up, so you all read Japanese. But essentially it says a bad partner is equal to 100 years of bad harvest. It's a little bit like my father used to tell me about marriage. The first 25 years are tough, but after that it gets good, so start getting married early. Now, you should think of EBRD a little bit, hopefully like a good partner that can help you adapt in a difficult operating environment. If you take the wrong partner with you, you can end up having 100 years of problems. At least that's what the Japanese are saying. But it also says something else, that you have to think long term. And that is so true in this sector. This is not a sector for short-term business, it's typically a sector for the long-term investors. I dare not even touch this anymore because I think, you know, I need something simple like a car. Good. So EBRD is in the middle of the donuts. That's where we belong. And on the two arms, you have two very different systems. You have the regulation and capacity of public institutions in the host country, that being in Mongolia. And on the right-hand side, you have the private sector that has know-how and has behavior. This is another system. And we, as a bank, are a bit in between. We work with both these two systems. And our idea is, by working with them and have a dialogue with them about policy and behavior and standards, we would be able to impact the cost, the risk, and the barriers to investment and trade. And if we can lower the risk, we can improve the trade, and you can have, so to speak, lower barriers to both investment and trade, then modernization to the country will arrive, and also innovation, if you wish. In other words, that's where you get the good investors coming in. If all that cycle keeps going, and it keeps feeding itself positively, then you will end up in Mongolia with a diversified and sustainable economy that has an industrial base that maybe goes beyond very focused mining, may well have integrated competitive markets, sustainable infrastructure, which is a big need in Mongolia, and also hopefully at one point somewhat of a less carbon intensive economy.
Next slide.
Yep. So yeah, that's good, let's take that one. So the social license to operate has a very specific definition. I'm going to break the definition in this presentation for a second and just say that when you're an investor, you need to, of course, with the government in your investment agreement, have a fair government take. The government take is what the government takes away from fiscal benefits from the project. Actually economic, but basically, most importantly, the fiscal ones. Taxes, royalties, and other sort of fees. If you take this and you also are committed as an investor to a good environmental, social impact assessment for your project, then you are already halfway done, because a good environmental impact assessment takes a lot of things into consideration. It has a consultation with the public, with the local mining community and so on. You know this. When we are involved in that, we have some very specific standards we add onto the process. We also help manage the process, speak to the local community, make sure their concerns are heard, their interests are looked at, and see whether we can create a good rapport and contract as a miner with the local community. Then we add also EITI, the initiative from initially actually Tony Blair in 2002, that later became a global standard for transparency in the extractive industries, and namely here in mining, where a key thing is that you also under EITI work with local NGOs and civil society organizations, because they, together with government institutions, are responsible for how EITI, how the framework will work in Mongolia. We as a bank have invested significant funds to the institutions in Mongolia to build EITI as a legal framework, as a support system, and building capacity with the local NGOs and civil society organizations, so we can have an informed process, a sustainable process, which helps our miners. And finally, of course, as a miner, you also want to have local content to some degree. It's often pushed a bit towards the miners. Now, local content comes in many shapes and forms, but it is to help develop, I will believe, mostly the local service industry. So we also, as a bank, help invest in SMEs, in service business that are servicing the miners, which of course helps altogether creating a service industry in the country. Can we move on? Now, if you are an investor and you might ask what are the problems, you're always being told, no matter what country you go into, that these are the problems. First, the investors are looking at saying, okay, so what is the ruling elite in the country? That can be the top government. It can also be someone who's not in government but actually ruling the country. What is their attitude to governance? And it basically comes down to some very simple questions. Is the ruling elite's attitude to governance that they rule of law? Rule of law means the law applies to everyone in the same way. Doesn't matter whether you're the king, the prince, the ambassador, or the banker, the law applies to everyone in the same way. But if you rule by the law, it's a little bit different. It basically means that the elite will say, the law applies to everyone except me. That's very convenient, by the way, because sometimes the law can be expensive to comply with and can be a bit irritating. So essentially, that's a key question. And this is still one that is being asked from time to time in Mongolia. I'll come back to why. The other question that the miners are asking is, how is the dialogue with investors going on and with NGOs and CSOs? Is this a sort of systemic, well-advised dialogue, or is it not? Then there are a number of other things when we have asked these questions. The next level of risk that is being looked at is, how predictable is the legal institutional framework? Like the ambassador mentioned, that's key, stability. And also, what is the attitude to that thing called the government take, I mean the investment agreement? How is foreign direct investment treated? Are the investors protected? Are they at risk of expropriation or nationalization of their assets or their earnings? And if there's a dispute with them, and this happens because every good marriage have a few disputes, how do we solve that? Do we go to international arbitration, or do we go somewhere else and decide? And then there's a host of other problems mentioned by investors, from bureaucracy to tenders, local service markets, how much can they help you, and so on and so forth. But it's a very useful catalog to keep in mind from time to time, as a checklist almost, when we have a dialogue with an investor. If we are a public institution, and if we are an investor, we're going to go and talk to the public institution about how do I invest in your country. Can we have? So I'll do this very quickly, because an often question I get in Mongolia when I speak to companies and institutions is, we know there are problems. What is the investors going to do about it? And it's an interesting question, and we get a little philosophical about it, but the investor here is in the center. And the investor, of course, is not a sort of clearly defined entity. An investor is a company typically, in most cases, and a company with a certain degree of capacity to solve problems. It's none different that from individuals. If you send a football player onto Old Trafford here, football playing in England, it makes a difference whether this person had actually played football before or not. Because if they have certain experience, they also know how to handle the ball, they know how to play the game, they know how to solve problems. Same here. Experienced investors go into these markets with a quite substantial degree of capacity to solve problems. So they anticipate problems, but they also have a certain capacity which they use to respond to problems. That capacity is valuable, it's also expensive. When you're in markets where there are not so many problems, guess what? You don't need so much capacity. There is, on the football pitch, a goal, one ball, you're alone, there's no one else, it's easy. But essentially in Mongolia there is a number of problems. So this is for the more experienced investors in most cases. Now the more the legal framework on one hand and the host covenant institutions on the other hand become, if I can say, unpredictable, changing all the time, fighting among themselves, the more the investor actually have to acquire more resources, more people, more advisors, more auditors, more lawyers, even more security, you mention it, in order to deal with all the problems that this creates. And this is a very important thing for institutions to be aware of. Because if you want to know how well you are doing in terms of investment climate in any country, speak to the investors, but ask them, how many resources do you need in my country to solve what you call the problems, compared to what you use in another country where you invest? And if they need a lot more resources in your country, it's a sign that they are maybe a bit under stress, and it's very expensive for them to operate. And it means that the next investor who speaks to the already investor in your country may not get a good recommendation to follow in. So this is absolutely key for policy making, to keep that dialogue going. So that is why it has a link to the investment climate, that has a link to the cost of operation, and eventually one day, if it's too difficult to operate, too expensive, the investor will sell the investment and leave the country, or even stop the investment and hope for better times, or even a different government. This is reality in investors. I'm just going to give you a final slot. I know my time is up. Let me just give you something to think about. It is provocative, so lashes of apologies before I show it. This could be for any country, okay? So give one click. So on this, I'm sorry you have to break your neck to read this. So this is the host country leadership's attitude to regulation. This is the ruling elite in the country. How do they think about regulation? Do they believe they are ruling by the rule of law? They mean everyone is under the law and they really mean it? Or do they believe they basically rule by the law? The law is very important, but I can be I have an exemption if I need to. I don't really have to fully follow the law if I'm under pressure. It's an important, simple question. On the other axis, coming up there, you have the institutions in the country. And here's a very simple observation. How good are these institutions to implement the law, the regulation needed to support the environmental compliance that international investors need? This is how good are they at implementing EITI and environmental social action plans. That has a lot to do with how they work with, among other, NGOs, CSOs, but also learning from experience. And whether the people inside the institutions are well educated and becoming increasingly more and more educated to make good regulation. And is looking to other places where it works well and bringing that experience back home to implement it. And let's just click a little bit. Now, if you rule by law and you have really weak institutions, you are typically in an environment where you have the autocracy. Now, I don't know if Turkmenistan is an autocracy, maybe it is. Certainly it could be. Now, this is a difficult place to operate for investors, so no surprise, you don't find many investors. It's also a difficult place to be an NGO or CSO because they are not welcomed by the government. They're basically asked to be quiet. So this is a difficult place to implement law. So if you want to go there as an investor, you need to have a lot of resources to deal with problems. And that's what investors do when they go to these type of countries. Continue, please. Now, if you have more capacity in the country, but maybe in terms of rule of law, you are still having an elite that really wants to be in control, then you may have a semi-democracy. Now, what the investors are worried about there is not so much whether they're going to have the assets nationalized like in the autocracy. And the autocracy is a bit like the clan economy, and when things go wrong, they fight. And when they fight, everything ends up in a bit sort of the fight. The assets are being taken, nationalized. You need a lot of good insurance when you operate there. But in the semi-democracy, the worry to the investors is a little bit different. It is that when they have a deal that becomes very good because market prices on the metal is going up, then they earn more money. And suddenly the government is saying, that deal is too good. It was not meant to be like this. We never thought they're going to earn so much money. We're going to change this. We're going to take something away from them. So they go to the investors and say, you know, you're earning too much money. We're sorry. We know we have a deal, but we are exempt from it now. So we're going to take more of your money. And that can, of course, be a disappointment. So that's the semi-democracy in essence. There is quite a lot of SMEs in that country. There are also good infrastructure, but up to a point. Can we have one more? Now we are in a place where we may not have such strong institutions yet, because it's a bit young, typically, institutions. But they're fundamentally, that country, pretty convinced that the only way for the future is to be ruled by rule of law. So there is a lot of transparency here. there are typically also a lot of governments. They tend to change many times. Now, sometimes when I look at Mongolia, you have, I think, 20 or 21 prime ministers in 20 years. So there has been some change. Now, this does not mean, but adhocracy is a little bit the situation where you have a government that comes in and it tells in the election campaign, we are going to make the country great for the first time, and we are going to do it by inviting in a lot of investors, and they're going to invest a lot. We're also going to have a great life. That is what they say. And then, of course, they go out and they do the right things because they do transparent tenders to investors. They offer licenses in an understandable way. You can have a good deal with them because they're actually pretty good people. They mean well. They want to push this and they need support. We love these type of countries because they are the hope for the country. But for the investors, there's also, of course, a risk. There's always a risk. Here the risk is, what if the government does not live up to all the promises it made in the election? Who will they blame? The government. Will they blame themselves? Or will they blame the investors? Will they blame the foreigners? Because if they blame the foreigners, you could have sort of a xenophobic backlash. And then you can be forced as investors to keep very high employment and pay very high taxes, even when the industry, the market price is starting to go down, and you would have to adjust in order to stay profitable. And that is typically the risk that you see in that type of environment. A lot of investors believe this is a little bit, this is simplified, I know, and you know that. But a lot of people think this looks a little bit like Mongolia. This is some of the risk we have seen in the past. The question is that the risk we will see in the future? The last one is one that does not come easy. This is a long experienced, well-established democracy. We have essentially some pragmatic government people in coalition in place. This is where the institutions are strong. They help one government to the other. Entrepreneurships and infrastructure is all very strong. There is a risk though. There's always a risk in life. The risk here is that there's a lot of investors coming. They're fighting for the assets. It's a great place to be. And the assets become very expensive. So you buy assets at a very high price because there's intensified competition. And guess what? Then China one day starts to buy less of the metals and the prices go down. And all these expensive assets you bought becomes unprofitable. Sounds familiar to many. From 2008 to 2009, that's exactly what happened in many of our markets in Europe, for example. So there's also a risk in that regard. Now, what does all this mean for an investor? It essentially means that investors, the big investors, they are in all of these places because they have many investments. So they are in the democracy, they are in the semi-democracy, they have a little bit in the autocracy, they have some in the adhocracy as well. And just imagine, they have to manage all this. This is a major portfolio task. And this is where it's interesting for Mongolia, because they will come to you, they will invest, and the better you can strike a deal and stick to it and work with your investors, the more you will convince that the next investor should follow in and also invest. We have as a bank our biggest portfolio of mining projects in one country of all the 35 countries we are working in, and that's in Mongolia. We took a bet on the adhocracy. Because we fundamentally like what we see in Mongolia. It's a difficult task the country is up against. No infrastructure in many places. But there is a willingness, and there's a very healthy civil society in Mongolia. It is not a country where you can easily see this falling back into becoming sort of autocracy. We had Genghis Khan at one point, but today you have many of them. And they work together, and they need investors. I think that has been the understanding from the past 10 years. So what we hope we will see in Mongolia is speak to your investors, listen to their problems, never forget for one moment that you are only one of many countries they're in. And being good to an investor has a huge, powerful message to all the other investors in the community who are wondering which country they should invest in next. And I will leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.